Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to day 2 of Davos. And more importantly, welcome to day 2 of the new golden era of the United States, which some of you may have noticed apparently began yesterday. We have obviously a new administration with lots of interesting plans for the US and the rest of the world. And I know we'll get into a little bit of that, those plans as they affect the US economy or expected to affect the US economy with this very distinguished panel. But I just want to, just setting the scene, we know, of course, that over the last few years, indeed over some time now, the US has been the outstanding economic performer in the global economy, sustained growth. It's recovered its pre-pandemic growth level and indeed growth trend faster than any of the other major economies in the world, continues to grow with low unemployment, so historically still very, trend unemployment is still relatively low. Growth has been good, looking at maybe 3% growth possibly in the current, the end of last year and the beginning of this year. Financial markets obviously have reflected that to some extent and both fed that, perhaps arguably. The extraordinary performance of the dominance of the US in global financial markets has only grown stronger over the last few years. So it's a it's been a largely benign picture. That's not to say, of course, there aren't challenges. Inflation remains a continuing challenge, a continuing threat, still well above the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. As a result of that, of course, and doubts about inflation, great uncertainty about monetary policy in the US, where it's headed. The Fed has started cutting rates, but there's great uncertainty about how much further, if indeed it does go any further, and what may be next and what that may mean for the US. And of course, that's reflected in what we've seen in financial markets in the last month or so with since the Fed started cutting rates. In fact, in September, very significant increase in bond yields. So there are challenges, unquestionably, and to add to all of that, of course, the geopolitical challenges, the increasing opportunities and challenges presented by AI and everything else that we're aware of. And of course, we say we do have this new administration, Trump administration, with itself a list of opportunities and challenges that some would say for the US economy on everything from immigration, energy, tariffs, of course, and we'll get into that, what that all may mean. And I couldn't let this go without also talking about the kind of new era that we have of what might be called Elonomics and the putative existence of a oligarchy in the United States now, and what that might mean, if it's true, for US economic performance and indeed for US civic affairs over the next few years. Anyway, we've got this very distinguished panel, very brief introduction, though they don't need any introduction. To my left, Brian Moynihan, you know, Chairman and CEO of Bank of America. James Quincy, Chairman and CEO of Coca-Cola Company. Vicky Holub, CEO of Occidental. And on the far left, Rich Lesser, CEO of the Boston Consulting Group. So a real people right at the forefront of the US economy and indeed the global economy, and they can tell us what's going on and what's going to happen. So let me start with a question to all of you, and Brian, I'll start with you, but I want all of you to answer it. The US has been the outperformer for the last few years. Why is that, do you think? What is it about the US that seems to have been able to withstand the global challenges and actually grow faster and better than most other major economies?
So if you think about the US and its ability to recover from crises over periods of time, take the medicine, get to the other side, and go, that's kind of in the spirit of the US. So the financial crisis came out faster because they basically wrote down the assets in the capital markets. The second part is the capital markets that can absorb activity and promote activity. And the third, and you mentioned it a little bit, is the consumer-led economy and the consumer spend. And so the stimulus in US that went to the customers to basically pave over the hole created by the recession after the pandemic, all that money ended up going back in the economy. It has a multiplier effect to it. So, that's the thing. And then innovation. At the end of the day, if you think about what's going on, the number of new companies forming, the number of business formations, the amount of capital that's going into AI, or you pick the topic of the last few years, clean tech, AI, et cetera, it's just massive because the investment pools are big and the capital's there and it gets rejuvenated. And we can't forget that the 2017 tax rate put the U.S. as a place that was now had a reasonably competitive rate as opposed to a rate that was way off the numbers. And then more recently, some of the work on the IRA and the prioritization put on that and certain types of investments that went into a bunch of states with real stuff coming out of the ground. And that all adds up to a pretty resilient economy. And that's what's kind of unique about the United States, is a consumer-led economy of size with open with the immigration coming in, with population growth and a large economy, tends to come back quicker, honestly.
James, Quincy, from the perspective of Coca-Cola, one of the great, most instantly recognizable global brands, with business literally everywhere. What's your perspective on why the US has done relatively so well in the last few years?
I mean, firstly, I would underline a lot of the factors that Brian has just talked about. And I think what's important about them is perhaps two things. One, they're a set of structural factors. They're not temporal, in the sense that the US is blessed with a set of physical resources, human resources, intellectual resources, a societal system that prioritizes dynamism and growth and innovation and change over necessarily certain other aspects. And those structural advantages can be enduring. And so I think that what we've seen over the last number of years is a platform from which to continue to grow way into the future for the US. So I think it's a profound structural advantage for the US that is enduring.
Vicky, from perspective of the energy companies, obviously, again, that's been one of the US's advantages, self-sufficiency now in energy production, largest oil producer in the world. What's your sense of what are the keys to US success?
I think it does relate to, go back to energy independence being a big part of that, and low-cost energy. Back in 2010, before the shale revolution really got started in the United States, we were only producing 5 million barrels a day. That wouldn't be nearly enough to meet our demand. Our demand is about 17 to 18 million barrels a day today, and it's growing. So 5 million barrels a day wouldn't have done it. But even though 10 other countries in the world likely have more oil reserves than we do ultimately, we've had to scrap around and do the best we could from an ingenuity and engineering standpoint to get oil out of the shale. We drilled through the shale for decades. But we didn't think we'd ever be able to produce from it. But developing the technologies of horizontal drilling and fracking enabled us to actually get oil to flow through this micro rock. And so that is what has given us now our energy independence. Right now we're producing 13.5 million, and only a little more than 4 million of that is coming from a conventional reservoir like the rest of the world is producing from. So we're really unique from that perspective. And so what's going to be key to us is to maintain that energy independence going forward.
Rich, from your sort of cross-sectoral perspective at BCG, and in particular comparing the US performance again, particularly with Europe, since we're here in Europe, and I'm sorry to sort of offend some of the sensibilities of Europeans, but Europe obviously has been relatively, underperforming the US now for a long time. And how do you see that in terms of what the US particular advantages with regard to Europe?
Honestly, if I had to boil it to one word, which several others have said, I would start with the word dynamism. I think there's just a dynamism in the US economy, whether you look at innovation, whether you look at people, whether you look at the willingness to deploy capital in very aggressive ways, a very aggressive venture capital market, willingness to try. And I think that this mindset of pushing to embrace the future and the fear of falling behind outweighs the fear of losing what we already have. And I think the capital markets help that, the Silicon Valley, the tech mindset, but you see it as much in the biotech world. We've seen it in healthcare. We saw it in the energy sector. That was a massive redeployment, that took place over, more than a decade to get it there. And I think, it's not that is completely absent in Europe, but I think a lot of the way Europe is geared is often more about protecting what's there. And I think that the bureaucracy in Europe is often more concerned about the risks of making change than the risks of inaction. And I think the US tilts more to the risk of inaction versus the risk of action. And we see it right now in the AI space. I mean, this isn't the first time. We've seen it in other places as well, including labor markets and other things. But right now, we just see the mindset of US, and I'm not just talking about the tech firms that are developing the LLMs, I'm talking about everybody else in the economy who is trying to figure out in the US as rapidly as possible. How do I embrace it? How do I translate it into meaningful business value that really impacts our customers, our productivity? And it's not that we don't have some European clients that are trying to do that, but the constraints, whether it's labor related, regulatory related, they just operate with more weight to the present that I think can often make it harder for great European companies to move at the pace.
Right, let me exploit the moderator's privilege here and play devil's advocate a little bit and offer you sort of what some people might say, kind of slightly cynical observation. While all of those things that you've all said are true, there are some big factors that have been big contributors to US growth over the last 4 years in particular. A massive fiscal deficit. The US has got a fiscal deficit now of close to 7% of GDP. That's after a long expansion with an unemployment rate of just over 4%. That's extraordinary and unprecedented. The last time the US has had a fiscal deficit on that scale has only ever been in wartime or in the midst of a deep depression. So we've had massive fiscal contribution to demand growth. We've had migration, significant migration. The labor market, I saw a study last week, I think it was by Barclays, that said of the roughly 16, 17 million jobs that the US has created in the last 4 years, at least half, possibly as many as 2/3, have come from inward net inward migration. So although the demographics of the US are slightly better than Europe, it's dependent heavily on inward flows of immigration, as we know. That may not last forever. And thirdly, a lot of the growth perhaps has come from financial conditions, to some extent a very easy monetary policy for a long time by the Federal Reserve until 2 years ago. But also you could argue, look at the state of financial markets, the money that's poured into particularly the big seven, the magnificent seven, tech companies, the extraordinary growth that that's produced in financial markets and the wealth effect that that's had on the overall economy. And that so my point is that while all these structural advantages the US has may be true, aren't there also these contingent factors that actually, frankly, whether it's the fiscal deficit or immigration or the state of financial markets, could be very much at risk? Brian, what's your view?
So I think sorting out, there's a lot in there, Jerry, but let's just sort it back a little bit.
That's probably the best thing anybody's ever said to me, I think, in the context of one of these discussions.
So I think let's just talk about the debt. There's no question we have to change the rate of growth of debt relative to the rate of growth of the economy. And that has to be done. And that's what the income administration and the last administration all have to struggle with. And there's no question that once you got past a certain point of the stimulus to pave over the hole created by the pandemic, you went beyond that. And then the Fed was too slow getting after inflation, so it got out front. But we've had a real interest rate in the U.S. now for a fairly long time. Monetary conditions have been tightened fairly dramatically. They're still tight, despite what people say, the inflation rate 3-ish, Fed funds 4.5. That's a real rate. And so I think they're pulling back on the economy hard, and yet it's growing through that. And that's the piece I think that's kind of interesting. So the question is, yes, we have to deal with the debt structurally. We have to figure out a way to slow down the rate of pace of spending and keep letting the pie expand around it. It's not like you got to do it tomorrow, but you got to get after this. We can't go on this fiscal thing. So yes, that probably helped a lot. The U.S. debt for last fiscal year was equal to the entire economy size of Australia, to give you a sense. So this is a big number, and it creates a lot of activity. But on the other hand, the throughput, the earnings power of the U.S. in a broad context, the throughput is strong enough that it can actually get ahead of that. We've done this at different times. So I think we can do that. We have to take it very seriously, and that's something. All the other issues you have are real. I think this issue is a little bit more isolated away from the innovation, dynamism stuff, because the private sector can't do much about the debt. It has to be managed from the central sector.
What about the rest of you on these, so whether the debt or whether migration or whether, again, this concentration of extraordinary financial growth that's occurred as a result of the boom, the tech boom, particularly around those companies? Anybody else want to weigh in on the questionable durability of those factors?
Look, I think they're all factors. I think Brian was very clear when saying, the debt can't continue to outgrow the economy endlessly. But that's also true. I mean, if we're comparing the US to Western Europe, UK, as a former UK more or less, he's still hanging in there. Our GDP...
A proud American, James, as he is well known.
Well known.
The accent may last, but the citizenship has changed.
The passport's changed.
Yeah.
UK government taxation is at a record high since the Second World War in the UK. The UK deficit is not that far off the US. Ditto France. Ditto interest rate. Like the package of things that need to be managed by the government is very similar in Western Europe. So that's not the big factor here. There was just as much going on in Europe as well. And so I think it is the demonstration of the dynamism and the structural advantages.
Vicky and Rich, you want to weigh in?
Well, I think it gets back to one of you got to have the fundamentals, you got to have the foundation of an economy that can be there and that's not susceptible to other economies in the world. I mean, we have a lot of independence, not just with energy independence, and I think that's really, really important.
Rich?
I just want to come back to the people part of what you said. I think it's so important. Part of the dynamism in the U.S. is because it's a magnet for talent from all around the world. So when you say that could be a reason, I think it most certainly is. Is that an excuse for the illegal immigration or the undocumented, whatever language you use, for the last few years? No, I don't think it is. I think that there's no question that the American people broadly, sure not everyone, but the majority for sure, would like to see illegal immigration stop. But our ability to preserve a culture where you can attract real talent from around the world legally into this country and use them to help fuel, whether it's fueling technology on the one end or just the massive need for construction work with all the construction that's got to happen in this country after all the disasters, the housing shortage, the infrastructure build we need to do. We shouldn't underestimate our ability to attract talent, the U.S. ability, as one of the important contributors. And I think if we were to shut that down, then there is risk.
Brian, you want to say something?
So, Vicky, being in the business, it's hard for her to talk about it in some ways, but think about what she said, fracking 2010 range. That's innovation. The oil and gas industry had 5 million barrels or something, a high cost of production, a lot of regulation around it. It was all innovation allowed that to reach. And then it busted in 15, 16 because the tail got, not the big company, the tail got hit hard because price came down and we wrote off a bunch of loans and recovered a lot of it, but it fell on its back for a while. And then it came back a different way. So that literally, and then emissions in the United States actually went down year over year. So you put this equation together, which is pretty wild when you think about it, of going from 5 million barrels of production to 13. Consumption, what was the 2010 consumption? I'm not going to quiz you, but you assume it was half what it is today or 3/4 or something like that and growing. And yet emissions going down. That's the innovation around use of and capture and other things. It's a pretty interesting story, but it has a failure in the middle of it, a partial failure. The wells that went into production off the fracking that didn't make it were big.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing it up because now you give me an opportunity to clarify a little bit. And that is that in southeast New Mexico, when we first started drilling in the shale, giving it our best effort in about 2009, 2010, those wells made 200 to 300 barrels a day. And we were thinking, oh my God, we got to spend this much money for 200 or 300 barrels a day. It's uneconomical. But we stayed with it, and the industry stayed with it. Quite frankly, they were the independent oil and gas companies, not the majors. The majors weren't going to mess with it. The independent oil and gas companies, with the help of Schlumberger and others, thank you for that. There was an effort to make sure that we applied innovation as we were going. And a lot of companies develop technologies, and they can develop technologies in the lab. Pharmaceutical companies can develop medications in the lab. What we knew is that to do it quicker, we had to do our research in the field, drilling the wells, and then seeing what they would deliver. So some in the investment community thought, my God, you're wasting all this money. But what did it get us? It got us to this 13.5 million barrels a day, and it got us to wells that now deliver 70 to 80% return on each well. And that was the innovation. The innovation was, and Rich has talked about it a lot, there was a lot of ingenuity, innovation, a lot of incredible ideas. And even today, we're continuing to make it better. We're continuing to make our wells better and to find different ways to produce it.
Let's move on to, again, the risks that we can look forward to, as it were, in 2025. We've talked a little bit already about the fiscal picture. Brian, you've talked well about that. and that'll come up again in the context when we discuss some of the things that Trump wants to do. But inflation, that seems to me to be the continuing big question mark. It's come down, obviously, from its peak of 2021 significantly, consumer prices down from 9% a year on average down to around about 3% now, depending which measure you want to use, but still comfortably above, as I said earlier, the Fed's target. The Fed's cut rates, now signaling the rates cuts are not going to be as much as we thought. Let me start with you, Rich, on the other end. How much do you, how much further do you think we have to go, both in terms of the inflation number, but perhaps more importantly in terms of monetary policy, before we do get down to a level that we can generally recognize as consistent with price stability?
I think we'd like to see, Brian, I would defer very much to Brian on how many rate cuts is the right number, but we're not there yet, and we need to bring some more. I think we're carrying, you asked a question about risk, and just to come at it, the way I think about it right now is we're living in a world of a high base and a high beta. The baseline for the U.S. economy is strong. Partly because we carry great momentum in, partly because there's a lot of lined up investment that's set to come, and partly because we're almost certain to face an environment where there'll be some relief on regulation and at least a continuation, if not some additional relief on taxes. And that combination should give the U.S. economy a lot of momentum. And the high beta, the uncertainty around that, is the combined risks that would make it harder to reduce inflation, interest rates, and would put upward pressure on inflation, which is the intersection of the deficit and will we really be able to cut spending more than we cut taxes, the pressure on labor, particularly depending on how deportation plays out, and the pressure from tariffs, depending on how implemented and how substantial. And all of them implemented to some degree might be stimulative, might take the strong base and make it stronger, but they also have a chance to make it harder to continue the positive momentum path we've been on. And so I think that's what we're going to see play out over the coming months and next couple of years of how that combination of forces goes. But the baseline starting point is strong, and I think the baseline, if we can keep it going, will be a few more interest rate cuts, and I think that would put the U.S. economy on a very strong path.
Brian, as the designated banker, do you agree? So when the Fed cut rates in September, according to its own projections, it was expecting rates, the Fed funds rate, to fall to around 3% by the end of this year. Obviously, market rates have gone completely the opposite direction. 10-year yields are up 100 basis points, while the Fed funds rate has come down 100 basis points. Now the Fed's, projection suggests, maybe it's currently about 4.25, by the way. Maybe it'll come down to 4, just a little bit below. What's your sense, Brian, and how close are we to dealing with the inflation problem and getting those rates further down?
So the inflation takes time to get out, especially for the pieces that are still there, which is around housing, because the ability to build housing is restrictive, and some of the other sort of market-derived metrics, so-called owner's equivalent rent. These technical terms mean something to a lot of economists. But so our team always thought it'd be the end of 26 till we saw inflation get close to the low 2s. And they never thought about it. What's happened is the economy's been stronger, and they've been upping their estimates for GDP, like at the end of 24 and into 25 from, they would have had, this time last year, they had this part of 25 basically 0.5% to 1% growth, maybe 1%, and now they're substantially not. And so our team, which is very strong, and they believe that end state is probably 4-ish. They moved up to 3.5. They probably think it's closer to 4-ish. So that would imply a couple cuts out there as they see it. And it'll be the 24-month period we're starting now where you'll finally see inflation come in. And as we look at from our customer data, which is James and others, if you look at from the customer data, the customers are spending very consistently with an economy that grows at 2% and inflation at 2%. They're spending about 4.5% of the money's going in the economy out of our customers' accounts first half of January versus last first half of January. They're employed, they have money in accounts, they have the ability to borrow, but they're being very rational how they're spending. And then that's good because it's a solid base, to Rich's point. And this summer I was a little more worried they caused the consumer to back off. When rates went up and the consumer said something's wrong, they kind of backed off. And then they came back in as the fall. And the minute they said rates come down, the confidence went up and the spending went back to the level. So what we see on that side, the piece that in the U.S. that we have to be careful is this rate of structure. actually affects small, medium-sized businesses more than anybody else. And they're still under a very restrictive rate regime because they went from 50 basis points plus their spread to 450 basis points plus their spread. That is a massive borrowing difference. And that they use lines, and they're not using them as much because it costs more. That's holding back development. And as the rate structure meanders in, and people, frankly, anybody under 40 has not seen this. So it's going to take getting used to. This is normal. What wasn't normal was the 15 years since the financial crisis. If you go back, the 10-year, I think the number is 70% of all the days it traded from World War II to now is traded at 4.5. They're around 4.5. If you go back since 1790, so we're in the third bear market for 10 years, and it always moves up around 4.5, 5, and sort of stops there, except for one period when the nominal rate environment in the 90s was really high. So this is normal.
And the strong investment performance also raises these Trump policies, the Trump second-term policies, assuming he gets tax cuts, tariffs, and significant reduction in immigration. Is that a net positive for the U.S. economy, or is it going to cause a surge in inflation or create other economic problems?
I think the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is the continuation of that is going to be positive for the economy. I think it was previously. I think it'll be that way again. I think he's going to find enough things.
Donald Trump's ear, by all accounts, has set this very interesting 3-3-3 target, he calls it. He wants to get GDP growth up to 3% from around 2.25% that we seem to have as a trend now. He wants the deficit down to 3% from, as I said, the 6.5%, 7% we have now. And he talks about increasing oil production in the US by 3 million barrels a day from the 13.5 million we have currently. Is that feasible, Vicky? And that's a 20 to 25% increase in oil production. Is that feasible? And how sensitive is the price if the US is going to suddenly increase its supply in that way? How sensitive would the price be? Give us your sense of how achievable that target is.
It's achievable given the resources that we have and our ability to execute. Would it be the right thing to do this year? It would not, because right now we're still in an oversupplied market. We've got to let some of the spare capacity get worked off. Then we have to, at that point, I think we can look at growing our production again meaningfully. So I think production in the U.S. is going to increase by maybe 200,000 or 300,000 barrels a day, 2025 to 2026. But I think it's going to take some additional monitoring, some additional reduction as we of the spare capacity, and then the demand is still going up. So I think by the end of this year, first of next year, there will come a time when we would be able to execute that and achieve it. And I think he didn't give a timeline. Thankfully, he didn't give us a dedeadline by the end of the year or anything.
There's an old economist saying, isn't there, when you're giving a forecast, either give a number or a date, but never both, right? That's the key to good forecasting. James, I'm going to ask this question because we just talked about it backstage, but I have to say that Donald Trump, the Wall Street Journal reported today that one of the very first things Donald Trump did other than the inaugural speech and the executive orders, the hundreds of executive orders, he reinstated the Diet Coke button in the Oval Office so that he can have a ready and immediate supply of Diet Coke. Don't let that in any way colour your answer to this question. But how do you view Trump's economics?
He's got a virtual button we can look at.
How do you view this picture that we've painted of Trump's economics? Tax cuts, obviously, tariffs. We'll get into tariffs in specific detail, I will. But what's your overall picture? Are you optimistic?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we spent the first 10 minutes talking about how the US had been the outperforming economy and how optimistic we were for the future. And he's Donald Trump. I thank him for being a consumer. He's the 25th inauguration we've seen since the start of the Coca-Cola company. I hope it works. Why would I not want it to work? I mean, I hope it works. There's a lot of puts and takes, things that are pro-growth, savings that they want to make on the efficiency side. I hope the package comes together and hits the 3-3-3. I mean, that's what we all want to have happen.
What do you think affect tariff? A 10% or a 20% across the board tariff imposition of tariffs would have? What effect would that have? I mean, on your business? Maybe it could be very positive, presumably, because there'll be that Mexican cola nobody will be able to afford anymore. But what do you? What's your? I mean, more generally for the economy, I can't find many people who are enthusiastic about a big across-the-board imposition of tariffs.
Well, look, a couple of things. First, it's all very hypothetical at this stage. There's not actually an instruction to do X. So it's very hard to argue a hypothetical question. Second, it's not in isolation. There's a whole load of other things happening. I mean, one of the reasons they said they wanted tariffs was to get rid of income tax. I mean, you can't slice a package and say, I hate this bit and I love this bit. The thing is going to come in a totality. And are we optimistic about the future, looking at the totality of the measures they're going to bring out? For us, it's not a direct, massive impact. It'll affect some of the things we buy. But the Coca-Cola company, at the end of the day, virtually all the Cokes you drink in country X are made in country X, whether that's the US, Europe, Latin America, anywhere you go, we're making the Cokes locally. So it's not a direct impact. But I think the key is to think of all these things in its totality. Are the totality of the policies going to deliver the growth we all want to have happen for the US?
Rich, let's stick, if I may, despite James's plea, stick specifically to the tariff question.
Sure.
And you deal with international businesses, and you're very familiar, long experience with the way global trade and global economic relations work. How do you think the US economy is going to respond if we do get a very significant increase in tariffs?
I think, I agree with James that you have to look at a combined set of things. When we've modeled through just the tariffs alone, but the extreme end of it, not necessarily I'm not arguing where we'll negotiate out to all of this, but if you just took 60 on China, 25 on Canada, Mexico, 10 on the rest of the world, it comes out to about a $700 billion. We've got a quite sophisticated trade model. It's about a $700 billion net impact on trade before retaliation, which you assume you'd get some response on the other side. So that would be impactful. That would have some positives. It would certainly raise a lot of revenue. It might allow for other things to happen. That would be impactful. It would probably have some inflationary impact. We don't know because exchange rates and other factors come into that are very difficult to model in advance. And that's a transitory inflation. That's a one-time step up. It's not that adds every year. I think if you combine that with a large number of deportations, if you combine that with a substantial increase in deficit spending, you could get into a scenario that would be quite concerning. But I would be very hesitant to project that future. I sort of where James is. I think the hope is that in the end of the day, the bundle of things that will happen, whether it's related to labor, continued attracting of quality talent into this country, the getting the right negotiation level on tariffs, the right progress on the deficit, that overall will be a positive outcome. But I think if you pick things that were talked about on the campaign, then you could get to a different place.
Brian, is that your view? Is it a negotiating tactic?
Well, that's clear because it was last time. I mean, and they said.
Well, he did actually impose tariffs last time.
Yeah.
So it's not like we're talking the abstract.
Yeah,
here.
no,
we do have the experience of tariffs. What happened when he imposed tariffs on China?
It was a negotiation. Remember, it was a negotiation on a bilateral basis to get China to buy more of certain categories of goods.
But the tariffs went in, and indeed on many goods are still in place. Biden kept them in place.
And they kept them in place. No. So our team, when they look at it, they think broad-based tariffs of 10% or so kind of get messed up in and don't have a lot of impact. As you go up more and more, exactly. At Rich's point, you start having impact, and then the question of what's the offset. I think the natural governors you're going to have on this is really, if the incoming Treasury Secretary said 333, if your goal is to hit all three, you're going to have to make trade-offs from the precision of what you said before based on very practical outcomes, right? So the idea that you're going to have a 3% growth. Matter of fact, remember the economy grew 3% in the third quarter of 2024. This is just maintaining. It's not actually. That's the main thing. So, I think they'll have to make those trade-offs. Is a tariff too high to slow down that growth immediately? Is it 3 million barrels the wrong thing because it's actually going to hit the price of oil, which actually creates more trade imbalance, honestly, to the U.S. because of the way that works. So there's all these different trades, and I think, but as you're pragmatic, the big difference when you ask, why do our people think the tariffs don't happen? They think the burden of regulation and deregulation will offset that. And literally, we just did a survey among our small business people of 6 months of surveys. And the regulations is what was their biggest complaint. Then it was inflation. That's actually come down now. And now it's shortage of labor. So if you're going out in the economy and talking to people out there and they say, I can't get labor again, what are you going to do on immigration policy? You're going to try to figure out how to solve this question, not end up with millions of small businesses saying, this is my problem, and why aren't you solving it for me? So these things do play off each other, but our people don't think tariffs are necessary inflation producing in a moderate amount, but they're depending on the deregulation to create other efficiencies in business that sort of effectively allow them not to pass them through and croak the
So
consumer.
it sounds like you all agree that tariffs, obviously it doesn't sound like you're fans of tariffs, but you all think that the proposals Trump have are, one, negotiable, and two, even worst case scenario, not necessarily going to do that much damage because they'll be offsetting factors. So you don't buy at all. The economists generally believe that the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the 1930s were a major contributor to global depression. You don't really think, anybody think we're in danger of repeating that historic mistake?
Nope.
No.
Because people talk about that.
Okay. Move on very quickly. Immigration. Little story. So I was waiting in line. I went to my favorite sandwich shop in New York City the other day. I live in New York City, and there was a line out the door for the sandwiches. I had to wait in line for about 20 minutes for sandwiches. One person working at the register, somebody turned to me and said, this is what America's going to be like when Trump deports all the migrants, don't you? Because we're not going to have any workers. Let me ask you, Vicky, first. If you are serious about not only stopping immigration, to some extent, by the way, we've seen that since the Biden moves of last summer, stopping all illegal immigration while allowing a certain amount of legal immigration, and deporting millions of people who are already here, where's the labor going to come from to achieve 3% growth?
Well, I think, like Rich, that if we have a challenge, we're going to meet it. And I disagree with allowing illegal immigration to continue. I think they have to be removed. So we're, as a country, just going to have to figure that out. I could say, just to tout a company in the state of Texas, go into a Buc-ee's and see how many people that they can feed in 5 minutes. So people are going to figure it out. We're the United States of America. We'll find a way to make it work. Right now, we're going with the easiest, simplest solution. But that's not where we have to stay.
But just, press you. Again, if you're able to significantly cut inward migration into the United States, especially illegal migration, do you think the US has sufficient, unutilized labor resources to fill that gap, especially without any kind of significant increase in
or
the wage level?
Now, the street, the guys that are on the sidewalk selling things, that's a different thing. But I'm talking about to be able to meet the needs of the United States people in whatever way, whether it's food services or whatever service it is. I think we can meet that challenge, but we're going to have to do it with innovation.
Opportunity.
Vicky?
I believe the same thing. We have a corporate conscience. We care about people, and we treat people the way we would want our family members to be treated.
And Rich, last word.
I think it's a very diverse country, and we need to create an environment where people feel included. Last.
That we are out of time. So I think to conclude, I'd say DEI is dead, the Republic will survive, and America will continue to dominate the world. What better outcome could we possibly have? Thank you all for being here. Thank you.